Tyrone was returning home late at night when he was suddenly stopped by two policemen. Without warning, the situation turns into a real nightmare, a brutal beating, false accusations, and an attempt to silence. But what happens next will turn everything around. Don't miss this exciting story until the very end. You'll be shocked. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see even more of these stories. Your likes and comments give a huge motivation to continue. Write in the comments what you think about this story and what moment hooked you the most. Tyrone sat behind the wheel of his car, exhaustion weighing heavily on him after a long day at work. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the last person on earth. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weariness that settled in his bones, eager to get home to his mother, Martha, and their small apartment on the other side of town. The thought of the warm dinner she always left for him gave him a small sense of comfort. As he drove through the dimly lit stretch of road, the rearview mirror suddenly filled with flashing red and blue lights. A police cruiser was tailing him closely. Tyrone felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a light. Confusion quickly turned into dread as the cruiser's siren wailed, signaling him to pull over. Tyrone's hands trembled slightly as he pulled the car to the side of the road. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the rapid beating of his heart. He knew the routine all too well. Stay calm, keep your hands visible, answer their questions, and hope that nothing goes wrong. He had heard the stories, seen the headlines, and knew how quickly a routine traffic stop could turn into a nightmare. He whispered a silent prayer under his breath. Two white officers emerged from the cruiser, their faces shadowed in the dim glow of the streetlights. They walked up to either side of Tyrone's car, their flashlights blinding him as they shined them directly into his face. "License and registration," one of the officers demanded, his tone cold and authoritative. Tyrone complied, handing over his documents with steady hands, forcing himself to keep eye contact. "What's the problem, officer? I don't think I broke any laws." The officer didn't respond immediately, his lips curling into a slight sneer as he glanced over the license. His partner circled the car, the beam of his flashlight scanning every corner as if searching for something, anything that could justify their presence. Tyrone's unease grew, a knot tightening in his stomach. He fought to keep his breathing steady. Suddenly, the officer on the passenger side began banging on Tyrone's window. "Get out of the car now," he barked. The demand was sharp, cutting through the night air. Tyrone's heart raced. "Why? Did I do something wrong?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even, but there was a tremor in it, a hint of fear that he couldn't quite suppress. The officer stepped back, placing a hand on the grip of his taser. "I said, get out of the car, now." Knowing there was no arguing with them, Tyrone slowly reached for the door handle, praying that any sudden movement wouldn't be misinterpreted. As soon as he stepped out of the car, the officers grabbed him roughly, slamming him against the side of his own vehicle. Pain shot through his ribs as his chest collided with the cold metal. His hands were twisted behind his back, and he could feel the bite of the handcuffs against his wrists. "I haven't done anything. Please, just listen to me," Tyrone pleaded. His voice strained as the fear turned into panic. The officers ignored him, one of them shoving him harder against the car. He felt his cheek press against the rough surface of the window, the smell of dust and metal filling his nostrils. "Shut up," the officer hissed, pressing a knee into the small of Tyrone's back. "You think you're tough, huh? Think you can run your mouth and resist arrest?" Tyrone's mind spun. Resist arrest? He hadn't resisted anything. His pulse thundered in his ears as he tried to understand why this was happening. He tried to glance around, hoping someone, anyone, might see what was happening. But the road was empty, and the shadows swallowed any sign of life. The other officer stepped closer, raising his baton. "You think we're playing games with you?" he growled. Without warning, the baton came down on Tyrone's side, a searing pain shooting through his ribs. Tyrone cried out, his knees buckling beneath him. He could hear them laughing, their voices low and filled with a cruelty that chilled him to the core. "Stupid punk. Thinks he can mouth off to us," one of them muttered, delivering another blow to Tyrone's side. The pain was blinding, leaving him gasping for breath. Tyrone's mind reeled, a desperate thought crossing his mind. Someone must hear this. Someone has to see this. but the road remained empty, the night as silent as a grave. He felt tears burning in his eyes, but he bit down hard, refusing to let them see his weakness. "Please, I'm not resisting." His voice was barely a whisper now, choked with pain and fear. The officers finally stopped, stepping back to admire their work. Tyrone lay on the ground, bruised and bleeding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He heard one of them snap the handcuffs tighter around his wrists, the metal cutting into his skin. "You're going down for assaulting an officer," the first cop sneered, pulling out a small notebook to start writing. "That's what's going into the report. You resisted arrest, attacked us. That's what they'll see." Tyrone's heart sank as the words sank in. He knew that his side of the story wouldn't matter, not when the only witnesses were the men who had beaten him. As he lay on the cold pavement, pain radiating through his body, he wondered if he'd ever see his mother again, or if this was how his life would end. Just another nameless, forgotten statistic. The last thing he saw before slipping into unconsciousness was the smirk on the officer's face as he snapped shut the notebook, sealing Tyrone's fate with a lie. Tyrone woke up in a cold, dimly lit holding cell, his body aching with every breath. His hands were still cuffed, his wrists raw and bruised from the tight metal. He tried to shift, but pain shot through his ribs, forcing a pained groan from his lips. The memories of the night before came flooding back, red and blue lights, the cruel faces of the officers, the feeling of his own blood running down his face. He swallowed hard, trying to push back the rising panic. The cell was small and reeked of sweat and disinfectant, the air stale and suffocating. Tyrone forced himself to sit up, wincing at the sharp pain in his side. He couldn't remember how long he had been there. Hours? Days? The only thing he knew for certain was that no one had told him why he was being held. He hadn't been given a phone call. He hadn't even seen a lawyer. He was trapped in a nightmare, with no end in sight. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy and slow. Tyrone looked up to see one of the officers from the night before, standing outside the bars, a smug smile on his face. He recognized him instantly, the same man who had taken pleasure in beating him, the same one who had written that false report. "Well, look who's finally awake," the officer sneered, leaning against the bars with a casual arrogance. "Hope you've had time to think about what you did." Tyrone's throat was dry, and his voice came out as a raspy whisper. "I didn't do anything. You know that. I never resisted. You? Save it." The officer cut him off, his smile vanishing in an instant. "You attacked us. You resisted arrest. That's what the report says, and that's what the judge is going to hear. No one's going to believe some thug over a couple of cops, especially not here." Tyrone felt a rush of anger and fear, but he bit back the retort that rose to his lips. He knew it wouldn't help. These men held all the power. He was just another black man trapped in their system, and they intended to keep him there. His thoughts turned to his mother, Martha, wondering if she knew where he was, if she had any idea what had happened. He could imagine her frantic, calling hospitals, calling friends, desperate for answers. The thought broke his heart. After what felt like an eternity, the officer finally left, leaving Tyrone alone in the cell with the crushing weight of despair. He closed his eyes, fighting the tears that burned behind them, trying to hold on to a sliver of hope that someone would come for him. But all he could hear were the echoes of the officer's words, reverberating through the empty cell like a death sentence. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Martha sat at her kitchen table, staring at the cold, untouched dinner she had made the night before. Tyrone had never come home, and she hadn't heard a word from him. Her stomach twisted with dread as she dialed the number for the local police station for what felt like the 100th time. "Police Department, how can I help you?" The voice on the other end was clipped and impatient, as if she were an inconvenience. "My name is Martha Johnson," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm looking for my son, Tyrone. He didn't come home last night, and I'm worried. I think he might have been picked up by the police." There was a long pause, and Martha heard the sound of shuffling papers. "What's his name again?" "Tyrone Johnson," she repeated, her heart pounding in her chest. "Please, I just need to know if he's there. He would never disappear like this without calling me." Another pause, then the woman's tone shifted, becoming cold. "We don't have anyone by that name here, ma'am. If he's in custody, He'll be processed soon. You should try calling back later." Martha clenched the phone tighter, her frustration bubbling over. "You've been telling me that all day. I just want to know where my son is." But the line went dead, leaving her with nothing but the dial tone. Martha dropped the phone onto the table, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. She had to do something. Sitting around and waiting wasn't an option anymore. She'd left the house, driving straight to the police station. When she arrived, she was met with cold stares and dismissive shrugs. The officers behind the desk treated her like a nuisance, refusing to give her any information about Tyrone's whereabouts. But she didn't back down. She raised her voice, demanding to see her son, making it clear that she wouldn't leave until she got answers. Finally, an officer appeared, but instead of offering help, he gave her a smirk that made her blood run cold. "Your son's being held for resisting arrest and assaulting an officer," he said, his tone dripping with false concern. "I suggest you get a lawyer, ma'am." Martha's heart sank as she heard the words. It didn't make sense. Tyrone had never been in trouble with the law. He wasn't the kind of person to fight anyone, let alone a police officer. She knew her son, and she knew when something wasn't right. With shaking hands, she left the station, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, but she knew one thing for sure. She needed help, and she needed it fast. She reached out to an old friend, a local lawyer, who had dealt with police misconduct cases before. Together, they began to dig into what really happened that night. As they searched for answers, they uncovered the damning report that the officers had filed. It painted Tyrone as a dangerous aggressor, someone who had lunged at the officers without warning. There was no mention of the beating, no mention of the injuries he had sustained. It was a complete fabrication, crafted to bury the truth. Martha's hands shook as she read the words, rage boiling in her chest. "They're lying," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They're lying about my boy." The lawyer nodded grimly. "I've seen this before. We're going to have to fight this, Martha. But it's not going to be easy. They're going to do everything they can to protect their own." Martha met his eyes, and in that moment, she felt a determination she hadn't known she possessed. She wouldn't let them destroy her son's life. She wouldn't let them bury the truth, even if it meant going up against the entire police department. She would make sure that their lies were exposed. The chapter ends with Martha and the lawyer beginning their fight for justice, while Tyrone remains trapped behind bars, his fate sealed by the words of those who had sworn to protect and serve. Martha sat at the kitchen table, her fingers gripping her phone as she stared at the screen, scrolling through the messages and comments, flooding her latest video. Her face was lined with exhaustion, but her eyes burned with a fierce determination. She had uploaded a video describing her son's arrest, the lies in the police report, and the injuries Tyrone had sustained. It was a plea for help, a desperate cry to anyone who would listen. She didn't expect it to reach far, but now thousands of people had seen it. Comments poured in from all corners, some expressing disbelief, others offering support. Strangers from different states shared their own stories of police harassment and wrongful arrests. It was like a floodgate had opened, revealing a torrent of hidden suffering. Yet, amid the encouragement, there were also messages of hatred, accusing Martha of lying, of trying to smear good officers. She tried not to let those words hurt her, but they stung like salt on an open wound. A knock at the door pulled her from the screen. She opened it to find a young woman standing there, clutching a microphone, a camera crew behind her. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm from Channel 12 News. We saw your video and we'd like to hear your story." Martha hesitated, the enormity of the moment hitting her all at once, but she nodded and stepped aside, allowing the reporter into her small living room. They set up quickly, and soon the cameras were rolling. Martha took a deep breath, steeling herself as she faced the lens, knowing that this might be her only chance to save her son. She spoke of Tyrone, how he had been a good student, how he worked long shifts to help with bills, and how he had never been in trouble with the law. Then she described the night of the arrest, how the police had beaten him senseless and fabricated a story to justify their violence. Her voice cracked, but she kept going, determined to be heard. "I'm not just doing this for my son," she said, her hands shaking as she gripped the armrest of her chair. "I'm doing this for every mother who's been through what I'm going through, For every family that's lost someone because of the lies and the hate, we deserve better than this. My son deserves better." The interview aired that evening, and the response was immediate. People from across the city and beyond began to share the footage, spreading it across social media, with hashtags demanding justice for Tyrone. It didn't take long before the story reached the ears of local activists, who invited Martha to speak at a rally organized in front of the police station. The next day, she stood before a growing crowd, holding a microphone with trembling hands. Faces stared back at her, a sea of strangers who had come to hear her speak. Some of them held signs with Tyrone's name, while others chanted for justice, their voices rising in a defiant chorus. Martha's heart pounded in her chest, but she drew strength from their presence. "This is not just about one arrest. This is about a system that has failed us over and over again," she said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "They thought they could silence us, that they could make my son disappear. But we're not going anywhere. We will keep fighting until they hear us." The crowd roared in response, their cheers echoing off the buildings surrounding the police station. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, Martha felt a glimmer of hope. She was no longer alone in her fight. There were others who believed her, others who wanted to see justice done. As the rally continued, she spotted familiar faces among the crowd, old neighbors, friends, even some former colleagues who had come to support her. But there were also new faces, young people, students, activists from other cities. Among them was a tall man in a worn leather jacket, holding a sign that read, "Justice for Tyrone." He approached her after her speech, his expression serious. "My name's Isaiah. I'm with the Community Defense Network. We've been dealing with police misconduct cases for years," he said, handing her a business card. "I saw your video. We want to help you and your son, Mrs. Johnson. We've got resources, legal connections, and we're not afraid to take on the police department." Martha clutched the card, barely able to hold back tears. "Thank you. I don't know what else to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just know that you're not alone," Isaiah replied, a determined look in his eyes. "We're going to make sure everyone hears what happened to Tyrone." Over the next few days, the momentum grew. The Community Defense Network helped amplify her voice, organizing more protests, pushing for a full investigation into the arrest. They connected her with civil rights lawyers, people who had fought similar battles before, and I knew how to navigate the labyrinth of legal loopholes the police often use to protect their own. Meanwhile, inside his cell, Tyrone heard rumors of the growing movement outside. He hadn't seen his mother since the night of his arrest, and the isolation was suffocating. But one morning, a guard tossed a crumpled newspaper through the bars, and Tyrone's breath caught in his throat as he saw his own face on the front page. "Local mother fights for justice after son's brutal arrest," the headline read. There was a photo of Martha at the rally, her face determined, holding a sign that read, "We will not be silenced." For the first time in days, Tyrone felt a flicker of hope. He knew that his mother would never give up on him. But now, it wasn't just her. There were people out there, strangers who believed him, who were willing to stand up for him. It was a small light in the darkness, but it was enough to keep him going. But the police department was not about to back down. As the pressure mounted, they launched a counterattack, trying to discredit Martha and the movement. They dug up old records, twisting the narrative to paint Tyrone as a troubled youth, someone who had always been a problem. They held press conferences, framing themselves as victims of a smear campaign, insisting that they had done their duty to protect the community. The narrative war escalated, but Martha and her supporters refused to back down. They continued to gather testimonies from other victims of police brutality, building a case that was impossible to ignore. The community's voices grew louder, drowning out the lies, and the police department found themselves on the defensive for the first time. Martha knew that the fight was far from over. She knew that the police would try every trick in the book to silence her, to make the public doubt her story. But she also knew that she couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not when Tyrone's freedom was on the line. The chapter ends with Martha standing in front of the crowd at another rally, the weight of her words resonating through the air as she vows to keep fighting until the truth is known. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers, all waiting for the hearing to begin. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with tension. Martha sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly together, her heart racing as she glanced at the empty defendant's chair, where her son would soon sit. To her right, Isaiah sat with a determined look on his face, a stack of documents in front of him, evidence they hoped would turn the tide. It had been weeks since the movement for Tyrone had taken off, and the pressure on the police department had only grown. Now, the case had finally reached the courtroom, and the truth would be put to the test. Tyrone's lawyer, a seasoned civil rights attorney named Miss Carter, had spent countless hours combing through the police records, looking for inconsistencies in the officers' stories. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Tyrone was led in, his wrists still cuffed. He looked thinner, paler, the marks from the beating still visible on his face. But when he saw his mother, a flicker of hope crossed his eyes, and he managed a weak smile. Martha fought back tears, reminding herself to stay strong. For Tyrone, for their family, and for every other person who had been wronged. As the proceedings began, the judge called the first witness, Officer Reynolds, the man who had written the false report. He stepped up to the stand, his face carefully composed, but there was a hint of unease in his eyes. He swore to tell the truth, then launched into the same fabricated story he had told since the night of the arrest. Tyrone had resisted, had tried to attack them, had left them with no choice but to subdue him. Martha gritted her teeth as she listened, anger burning inside her. But Miss Carter was ready. She stood up, her voice clear and calm. Officer Reynolds, can you explain why there are no injuries documented on you or your partner's medical report, despite your claims of being attacked? Reynolds hesitated, glancing at the other officers, sitting at the back of the room for support. It's possible that the injuries were minor. They didn't require documentation. Miss Carter nodded, as if she expected this answer. She handed a sheet of paper to the judge and the jury. This is a copy of the emergency room visit records from the night in question. Tyrone Johnson suffered a broken rib, multiple contusions, and a concussion. Can you explain how a man with such injuries could have posed a threat to two fully armed officers? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his confident demeanor cracking. Look, it was dark, and things got out of hand. He resisted, and we had to use force. Or perhaps, officer, you used force because you knew you could get away with it. Miss Carter shot back, her voice rising. Perhaps you thought no one would question your version of events. Reynolds' face reddened, but he remained silent. Miss Carter seized the opportunity to press further, revealing discrepancies in the police report, pointing out how certain details had been changed or omitted to paint Tyrone as the aggressor. The jury watched intently, and murmurs rippled through the courtroom as each new piece of evidence came to light. Then, Miss Carter called her next witness, a man who had come forward just days before, a local resident who had been walking his dog near the scene of the arrest. He took the stand nervously, but he spoke clearly as he described what he had seen that night. I heard shouting, so I went closer to see what was going on. I saw the officers pulling Tyrone out of the car. He wasn't fighting them. He kept saying he wasn't resisting, but they kept hitting him, the witness said, his voice shaking slightly. I thought about recording it, but I was scared. I'm sorry I didn't do more. Martha's heart swelled with gratitude for this man's courage. His testimony was a crucial piece of the puzzle, challenging the officer's narrative in front of the jury. She could see the expressions on the officers in the back of the room shift. Anger, frustration, and a hint of panic. The cracks in their story were widening, and they knew it. But the turning point came when Miss Carter revealed the final piece of evidence, a series of internal police memos that Isaiah had managed to obtain through a whistleblower. The memos detailed complaints of excessive force filed against Officer Reynolds and his partner in previous arrests, complaints that had been quietly dismissed by their superiors. Miss Carter presented the memos to the court, holding up a copy for everyone to see. This isn't the first time these officers have been accused of using excessive force. It's simply the first time they've been caught. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the press scrambling to capture every word. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. The police department's facade of integrity was crumbling, and they couldn't contain the fallout. Reynolds' lawyer attempted to object, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The judge allowed the evidence to stand, and Miss Carter wrapped up her cross-examination with a final, cutting question. Isn't it true, Officer Reynolds, that you and your partner assaulted an innocent man and lied to cover it up? Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. He glanced toward his partner, who looked equally stunned. Then, at the jury's cold, disapproving stares, he realized that the safety net of impunity that had always protected him was gone. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The next day, the courtroom was filled to capacity again, but this time, the atmosphere was different. The police department, sensing that they could no longer shield their own, had turned their backs on the officers, distancing themselves from the scandal to save face. The officers were left to face the consequences of their actions alone. In a surprising twist, Reynolds took the stand again, but this time his demeanor was different. No longer defiant but resigned. With a shaky voice, he confessed to the lies in the report, admitting that he and his partner had used excessive force against Tyrone without cause. He tried to justify their actions, but it was clear that he was hoping for leniency by admitting the truth. Martha listened to his words, her hands trembling with a mixture of relief and anger. It was a victory, but it came at a price. Tyrone's pain, the fear they had lived with for weeks, the trust that had been shattered. As she glanced at her son, she could see the toll it had taken on him, the weight of the injustice that had nearly crushed him. The chapter ends with the judge announcing that the trial would continue, with the officers facing charges of assault and falsifying evidence. Tyrone and his family would have their day in court, but Martha knew that this was only the beginning of a long battle for true accountability and change. The courtroom was silent as the judge cleared his throat, his voice reverberating through the chamber. Tyrone sat next to Miss Carter, trying to steady his breath, while Martha clutched Isaiah's arm, her heart racing. This moment was the culmination of everything they had fought for, the lies, the pain, and the months of struggle. Yet, despite the gravity of the moment, there was a glimmer of hope in the air, a feeling that the tides had turned. After reviewing the evidence and witness testimonies, the judge began, his tone heavy with the weight of his decision. It is clear that serious misconduct occurred during the arrest of Tyrone Johnson. This court finds the officers, Reynolds and Harris, guilty of assault, falsifying evidence, and violating the civil rights of the defendant. Gasps filled the room, followed by a swell of murmurs. As reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, the officers sat at their table, their faces pale and drawn, no longer protected by the shield of the badge. For the first time, they were being held accountable for their actions, and the realization cut through their arrogant facade. Tyrone felt his breath catch, the words sinking in like a lifeline. He glanced at his mother, seeing the tears streaming down her cheeks, the joy and relief mingling with the pain they had both endured. Martha covered her mouth, struggling to contain the sob that tore from her chest. After everything, after all the nights filled with fear and uncertainty, justice had finally prevailed. As the officers were escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, a small cheer went up from the crowd of supporters gathered outside. People held up signs, chanting Tyrone's name, celebrating the rare moment of victory against a system that had long seemed untouchable. Cameras flashed, capturing every moment, every tear, every smile. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was more somber. Miss Carter turned to Tyrone, offering a tight but genuine smile. "This is a win, Tyrone. But remember, the fight isn't over. There's still a long way to go." Tyrone nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The scars on his body and the trauma he carried inside him wouldn't fade easily. But for the first time since that fateful night, he felt like he could breathe again, like he had been pulled back from the edge of a darkness that had almost assumed him. Martha took his hands, squeezing them tightly, as if afraid to let go. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We made it through this. We're going to get through the rest, too." He held her close, feeling the warmth of her embrace, a stark contrast to the coldness he had endured in the cell. He knew that their lives would never be the same. Too much had been lost, too much broken, but together they had found a way forward, even when the world had tried to crush them. Outside, the scene was chaotic as reporters rushed to interview the key players in the case. Martha found herself surrounded by microphones and cameras, but this time she spoke with a strength that surprised even her. "This isn't just about my son," she told them, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This is about all of us, every family that has suffered in silence, every life that's been torn apart by lies and violence. We have to hold them accountable, not just today, but every day, until the system changes." Her words spread quickly across social media, reaching far beyond the small town where it had all started. The movement that had begun with one mother's desperate plea for justice now had a life of its own, inspiring others to come forward with their own stories, demanding accountability and change in their own communities. For Tyrone, the weeks that followed were a blur of interviews, meetings with activists, and speaking engagements. He found himself standing before crowds, sharing his story with a mixture of fear and determination. It wasn't easy. Each time he spoke, he had to relive the worst night of his life, to feel the cold bite of the handcuffs, the searing pain of the baton, but he did it because he knew that his story could make a difference. One evening, after a particularly emotional rally, he sat with Martha and Isaiah in their small living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. Tyrone glanced at the scars that still marked his arms, reminders of the pain he had endured, but also of the strength he had found. He turned to his mother, seeing the lines of exhaustion etched into her face, but also the fierce pride in her eyes. "Do you think this is really going to change anything?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost unsure. Martha took his hand, her grip firm. "We've already changed things, Tyrone. Maybe not the whole world, but enough to make a difference, enough to show people that they don't have to stay silent." Isaiah nodded in agreement, leaning forward in his chair. "They'll think twice before they try to sweep another case like this under the rug, and that's a start." Tyrone looked out the window, where the last rays of the setting sun cast a warm glow over the streets. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that a better future was possible. He knew the road ahead would be hard, that there would be setbacks, that change wouldn't come overnight, but he also knew that he wasn't alone anymore. As the days turned into weeks, the case continued to make headlines, sparking debates about police reform and accountability. Local leaders began to discuss new policies, and the officers involved faced prison time for their actions. The police department, once defiant, was now under federal scrutiny, with calls for new leadership and reforms that aimed to prevent another case, like Tyrone's, from happening again. In the end, Tyrone and his mother found themselves at the center of a movement that had grown far beyond their small town. They had faced the darkness together, and though the scars would never fully heal, they had found something stronger than fear: hope. The story ends with Tyrone standing in front of a crowd at a rally in a neighboring city, his mother by his side, as they lead the crowd in a chant for justice. The echoes of their voices fill the air, a promise that their fight is far from over, but that they will face it together. Tyrone's story shows how the struggle of one man and his family can change an entire system, but it doesn't end there. After all, for every word of truth, for every step towards justice, there are those who are not afraid to speak. What do you think about what happened? Do you believe that such changes are possible in real life? Write your opinion in the comments. It's important for me to know what you think. If you liked this story, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new stories. Your support helps to tell even more stories that are important to hear. And don't forget to click on the bell to be the first to know about the new releases. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.